Right, well, hello everyone. Sure, I don't need to, but I'm just going to give Judith a short introduction here. Judith was born and brought up in Perthshire. She studied English and medieval history at St Andrews University and spent the early part of her career as a librarian, which seems a very fitting occupation for a poet. Works in IT and lives in Aberdeen. Now, Judith's been widely published in magazines and has several chapbooks and two full-length collections under her belt. She's a volunteer with Pushing Out the Boat magazine and has been the co-editor of the highly respected Poetry Scotland magazine since I'd like to start off by asking you a little bit about your journey into poetry. What brought you into poetry, and who and what would you say have been your influences, past and present?
Well, my early introduction to it was really the Victorian poets. My dad habit on long car journeys when we complained of being bored, of reciting chunks of The Lady of Shalott at us. He had had to learn this off by heart at school, I suspect for a punishment, although he would never admit that. And I don't think he was trying to assuage our boredom. I think he was trying to encourage us. And I don't think he was trying to assuage our boredom. I think he was trying to encourage us not to moan about it anymore. But he would start off with great, on either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye. So, and he would get about a verse and a half in, and then he would kind of lose the plot a bit and make the jump. Get about a verse and a half in, and then he would kind of lose the plot a bit and make the jump to where the mirror cracks from side to side. So it was years before I found that poem in a book and realised that it does actually have a storyline. Silly storyline, but it is a storyline. And the other thing was Kipling. My mum had a presentation set of The Jungle Book that she had, I think, got as a school prize. And when I was old enough to be trusted not to scribble on books, I was allowed as a great favour to have this in my bedroom. And that was what I used to read under the covers. And the poems in The Jungle Book, again, were kind of one of my introductions to poetry. And then we're quite, there was a lot of Alfred Noyes, The Highwayman, and Sherwood and the Red Dawn is Robin Hood Awake and all that sort of thing. So I started off really with the idea of poetry as a thing from the past. And it was a long time before I caught up with the idea of it as a contemporary thing. The curriculum, posh white guys as well. We did one Edwin Morgan poem for O grade as a sort of token effort, but mostly it was things like Keats and Browning, who I have a great love for. Both the Brownings, actually. I like Elizabeth Barrett Browning as well, but if the two of them were alive, she would have to fight. It wasn't, even at university, I mean, at the time I was at university, creative writing wasn't an option in English. You did it as a thing to study. And the syllabus at St Andrews at that time stopped at Auden and Eliot. So, nobody alive was on there at all. And it wasn't until I did write poetry when I was a kid, and then I kind of stopped when I had to study it as a subject. And it wasn't until after I did English literature, as Andrew says. I did English literature, as Andrew says. It wasn't until after I'd stopped that I was able to think of it as something I could write again. And what happened actually was that the first year I worked in libraries after I left uni, I was cadging a room off for my brother who lived in Edinburgh at the time, and one of his friends took me to an open mic. Cadging a room off for my brother who lived in Edinburgh at the time, and one of his friends took me to an open mic night, an event called First Friday Poems and Pints, which used to happen at the West End Hotel in Edinburgh, and it was 3 or 4 writers groups got together and had this once a month night. And I never got the nerve at that one, but that was my first exposure to open mics and to poetry that, the poet was standing there in front of you. And when later on, when I went to the University of Sheffield to do my librarianship qualification, I enrolled at the public library, and they had a terrific contemporary poetry alphabet. So I was reading poets like Fleur Adcock, Benjamin Zephaniah, people like that, totally unheard of in my education. And the other thing that I kind of read out with the curriculum was Scottish poetry, because there wasn't, apart from this one token Edwin, it was only really Burns, and schools at that time still felt it was their mission to stop you speaking sloppily. There was a boy in my primary 7 class who got belted for persistently answering questions I rather than yes. So when we were questions I rather than yes. So when we were trudging through Keats's Ode to Autumn yet again, I was kind of reading the other bits of the book surreptitiously, and we had a collection that had things like the Border Ballads. It had Ferguson. We had this collection. We only used this. This is not the school's copy that I nicked. I bought it later. I promise. We only used this for that one Edwin Morgan poem, but this was the book where I met Marian Angus and Violet Jacob and Ian Crichton Smith. And although it's only the English translation that are in here, it was my first exposure to some of the Gaelic poets like Derek Thompson. So it was a kind of unstructured way to do it, but my writing came back along with my learning about contemporary poetry, and it all kind of happening about contemporary poetry, and it all kind of happened off syllabus. That's not what it's like for everybody, but that's the way I learned it. And I mean, there's a lot of things I did learn on the English lit curriculum, particularly things like Old and Middle English, which I wouldn't have read for myself. But a lot of the early influences were either these Victorian things, which are not always a good influence, because this is poetry with a very determined structure and rhythm, and sometimes if you're writing stuff just to pad out the line, and when you could be starker and more to the point. But those were my influences.
You think you put your finger on it. It's that elevated style that you always expect to aim for, and just you completely miss out any of this.
The idea of poetry talking in a language you might overhear at a bus stop was quite a late thing for me to get to grips with. Really not until I was into my 20s.
Well, I went through a similar kind of curriculum to you, and very old-fashioned. And the school I went to was screaming and kicking to get to you, and very old-fashioned. And the school I went to was screaming and kicking to get into the 17th century, I think. But I was a teacher for 40 years, and when we started, as you say, we were not encouraged to be teaching texts in Scots. Ironically, the one thing that sometimes vernacular Scots, but it's so out of date for the pupils that they didn't really get it. I was going to ask you, who would you say would have been your most important Scottish poet?
Probably Ian Crichton Smith. I was lucky enough to hear him read once, actually, at the Dunfermline International Festival of the Arts, when there was such a thing. And he read some of his poetry. He read a couple of his short stories as well. And, beautiful elegiac work. Stories as well. And, beautiful elegiac work. And in between, he did nothing but make inflammatory racist remarks about people from Harris. One of the stories he read was one of his Murdo stories about how they were trying to build a rocket to get to the moon, and it was really important that Lewis got there ahead of Harris, and that kind of set him off. And this is in Dunfermline. I don't imagine there was a person from Harris within a 50-mile radius, but he felt it necessary to just make the point that they were all good for nothing. But yeah, he writes in a kind of plain English style, but also sometimes a more elevated, a slightly more elaborate style. And he talks about mythology, and there's a set of sonnets of his of Orpheus and Vulcan, and it's a terrific set of poems. What I didn't know, really, apart from the fact that there are some poems he writes about Gaelic, but I'd never come across any of his actual Gaelic poems until quite recently, when I started to learn a bit of Gaelic myself. The first Gaelic poet I was really exposed to was Derek Thompson, and then Angus MacNichol, who used to read at the Wayward Festival when that happened. I don't know if anybody remember hearing him there, but he was a terrific reader of his own work.
I think we've got one or two heads nodding there. Now, you've produced quite a collection of work now, and I'd like to pick your brains a little if I could. You've been very widely published, as well as having these two full-length collections that spoke about not in Nightingale Country and Across Your Careful Garden. Can you tell us a bit how you go about? Do you need to have a huge amount of work under your belt before you try to shape them into a collection?
It's worth having stuff to perm from.
Yeah.
And that was certainly easier with Not in Nightingale Country than with Across Your Careful Garden, because I just had more in reserve. And what I basically did for Not in Nightingale Country, Sheila asked me, my publisher asked me if I had them. The initial two pamphlets, one was a sequence of poems I wrote over the course of a year. So a seasonal arrangement was quite an obvious one for it. The second one was a thematic one. It was all on the theme of green and grey and white ladies. And I structured it really. I placed the big poems and then I placed the little ones in between, because in a pamphlet you don't have much leeway for letting it drag. You have to. Not in Nightingale Country, what I did was go through my folders, pick out all the possibles, put them in heaps, and then I have several themes that I come back to: the history geek stuff, the landscape stuff, the legend stuff. And so I had all these wee lists of, that I always have to ration myself on the history geek stuff. So pick out some of those and then think about setting them out so that, they're not too clustered together, the history and the more personal ones and so forth were spaced out. For Across, working on a second collection with the idea of having performing arts as a theme, and then the pandemic happened. So the only performing arts poem really that's in there is one about the closure of His Majesty's Theatre, and one about a performance of Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds, which was done over Zoom in lockdown. The original thought with that was I was going to have the sort of pre-pandemic stuff, I was going to have the stuff I wrote in lockdown, and then I was going to have the stuff afterwards. But echoing what Penny said, it is really important to have beta readers. And for structuring both those collections, I had a beta read from John Boland, whose work some of you may know, who was really, really helpful. With the first one, he said, you realise it starts off cheerful and gets gloomier and gloomier and gloomier. That's not going to work. You have to have a strong start, then that's not going to work. You have to have a strong start, then behold the har, and then some sunshine at the end. So I shifted the structure a bit for that. And similarly with the second one, he said, you've got a winter poem followed by a spring poem followed by an autumn poem, and that you would be better with one seasonal arrangement. And again, so that's what I did in the end. The book is in 4 sections, which are roughly seasons: autumn, winter, early spring, late spring, early summer. And most of the pandemic ones are in winter, because that's their mood, even if they weren't actually written in winter. So poems in both the development of both these collections that didn't make the cut, and that I still hope to
find a home
for somewhere else. But you have to be a wee bit ruthless. And also with a poetry collection, again, length constraints can be quite brutal. Produce in print relative to how well it sells. And the slimness of the standard poetic volume is not an accident. It's partly that poetry is quite intense, and a small collection is often quite enough. But it's also to do with publishers' margins and costs.
You've already mentioned, some of your personal experiences and your own background inform your writing. What would you say are your major themes, as well as the history geek? What would you say are your other major themes?
Well, Something I didn't really realise until the way some people reacted to the poems in Not a Nightingale Country is that I'm quite strong on narrative. Again, this is Kipling and Hardy coming through, I think. There's backstory a lot of the time. I'm often, particularly in the first collection, I'm often writing poems where I'm inhabiting somebody. Particularly in the first collection, I'm often writing poems where I'm inhabiting somebody's point of view. So there are fewer poems like that in the second collection because a lot of it was written in isolation, and there's a lot more of kind of me looking out the window at things. And also it was written across the period when my father's health was failing, and there are some more personal poems about that I probably wouldn't have thought about writing and publishing at the time I was doing the first collection. So I think that's the influence of Browning, that I do characters, whether they're from history or from mythology or just from things I overhear. I walk to work nowadays, which is not quite so good for the eavesdropping, but when I used to go to work on the bus, that was a great source of found poetry. So natural world come into what I write quite a lot as well. And politics sometimes, but quite often those are poems that are of the moment and they don't end up in the collection. There was one I was very fond of that I wanted to try and get into Across Your Careful Garden, but it was about Theresa May, and she had long since ceased. That book was going to be in press, so there was no point, and people would have just been baffled. So that one has become a kind of a historical artifact of its own.
Yes, I mean, even Trump one day will be a distant memory, I
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a poem in Across Your Careful Garden that's about Boris Johnson, but I wrote about him by writing about Romulus Augustulus, the jumped up pipsqueak upstart last Roman emperor.
Now, a bit of a shift now and put you to the other side, if you like, of the production of verse. You've been involved with editing publications like, as we said, Poetry Scotland, Pushing Out the Boat. And I wonder, could you give us a few insights maybe into how you would go about other people's work and editing other people's work for publication? What you look for in submissions?
Some of it is trying not to have particular things you look for, because some of it is that you want to be open to stuff out with your own comfort zone. It would be very easy to stuff out with your own comfort zone. It would be very easy to let your own preferences be overly influential. And Andy and I on Poetry Scotland joke about this. There was at one point where we had 3 poems for a poet from a particular poet, all of which were really good, but we only had room for one. These is your favourite, and I was saying, I don't know which of these 3 equally good poems, one of which mentions the Antonine Wall, do you think is my favourite? And in fact, on that occasion, the Antonine Wall one got in, but there was another occasion I can think of where we'd a choice of 2 poems, and one of them was using Scottish mythology. But we already had 2 or 3 poems of that type in the issue, and so we went for the other one, which was about science and technology, because it was more different. Have to try and, I mean, there are 2 things. One is the volume of submissions you get for any given issue. You really have to try and give yourself time and pace yourself, so that you're not reading too many submissions at a go, because otherwise you get completely blasé, and that's not fair to the writers. So for short stories, when I'm selecting short stories for Pushing Out the Boat, I'll maybe read 2 or 3, and that's all I'll do today, and then I'll go back again and probably read 10, and that's enough for a night. So you're kind of torn between trying to turn it around as fast as you can, but also be fair to all the writers. And quite often it's a kind of, you know it when you see it kind of thing. Any given, I've never team, Andy and myself at Poetry Scotland, and normally there are 3 prose panellists reading the short stories for Pushing Out the Boat. which means you end up with a spreadsheet and marks out of 3. There's no other way of doing it. But there will always be some submissions that are just so good everybody says yes. Good everybody says yes immediately. You'll get 2 or 3 stories, maybe a dozen poems that are undoubtedly the real deal, and you'll get quite a small number who they just haven't quite, they're over the length, or they just don't work, or they just don't work. In the middle, you've got this huge range of possible poems or stories, and that's where the close reading and things like thinking about factors that are not the quality of the work itself, because the quality is good enough. Do we want more Scots in this issue? There was one memorable pushing out the boat where we paused for a tea break halfway through the prose selection meeting, and somebody said, "So how many dead people are still on the shortlist?" because that year, every year you see there are particular themes that a lot of people are drawn to, and this year it was death. And the answer to the question was actually depends whether you count Elvis or not. Elvis made the cut because that was a really excellent story, but some of the other dead people, good as they were, had to give way to something that was not dead people. Otherwise, we were just depressed the readers out of. And it's often the same when you're selecting poetry. You've only got a given amount of space. It would be lovely to be able to publish everything that you get that you like, but again, literary magazines exist in permanently perilous financial situation, and you're trying to at least break even, which means more pages is more cost, higher cover price, fewer sales. So you're trying to keep within a certain limit, and you're trying to go for a variety. This has influenced a bit the way I go about submitting poems myself. Yeah. That rather than clustering things around one theme, I'll maybe send, if they're looking for 3 poems, I'll send 3 that are quite different themes. So, there's an option there that, if they get deluged with History Geek theme poems, maybe one of my other poems might be in with a bit of a better chance. It's a difficult balance because the popular themes are popular for a reason. Love, death, childhood. The popular themes are popular for a reason. Love, death, childhood, all these things are what people respond to and understand. But a well-worn theme is also one that will get a lot of submissions, and you have to be really good to make the cut. Whereas you don't want to be quirky for its own sake, but something that's off the beaten track a little might stand a better chance. It's a constant balancing act, and it's huge fun, but it's also a huge responsibility because people put their creativity on the line, sending stuff out both sides. It's you do feel it as a responsibility as well as a joy.
You feel that a covering letter, for example, has got to be carefully thought out, or a biography, or are these things secondary to? I mean, in your way of going through the process, would you go to
read anonymously? So yes, yeah. Covering letters, biography, none of that counts. We don't find out who anything's been written by till after. Although, if you're going to open mic nights and readings and stuff, the chances are some stuff will come up that you've heard a draft version of from the horse's mouth at some point. But we don't look at biographies or anything. Poetry Scotland doesn't use biographies. It's just the poem and where the poet comes from. There are magazines where a good covering letter can make a difference because it makes an impression. I'm not very good at them myself. I hope you enjoy them. Thank you. Goodbye. I think that's probably quite different from a novel submission process, because there you've got a chapter and you've got the kind of the follow-up information that the publisher will, so a novel pitch will so a novel pitch will be quite different, I think, from submitting to a magazine. And actually, that's one thing I will say that really struck me from what Penny said, the advice you got about the book had to hit a certain mark earlier. A lot of the hit a certain mark earlier. A lot of the prose submissions we see for Pushing Out the Boat could do with hitting their mark a bit earlier. They start off well and then they cram too much in at the end. So, you know, if you're preparing stuff for submission, be ruthless with it. Ruthless with it, really. Be ruthless with it before you send it to the ruthless, heartless editors.
That's fascinating insights from both sides of the creative process there. I'm just wondering, has anyone in the audience got any questions?
A question of observation. I'll realise by the time I finish what to do.
Has it got a question mark at the end?
Yes, I'll put a question mark. Usually this. I understand why magazines go for poems, but it allows for hopefully for the sanity of the people who are editing. And that they don't want umpteen versions of Paradise Lost and Broad Shetland or Burrick. But is there a danger that that is imposing another form of uniformity of people's perception of what poetry is?
I think absolutely, yes. And as somebody who likes to write at a bit of a length myself, as a person submitting poems, I find it frustrating. With Poetry Scotland, we have a maximum line length for submissions, but within that you can do up to 1 to 3 poems. So we could, and we have sometimes taken a submission that's 100 and odd lines long, and it's the whole of the 100 and odd lines long, and it's the whole of the person's allowance, if you like. And that is actually something in the inheritance of the magazine. I don't know how familiar you are with Poetry Scotland, but it started as Sally Evans and Ian King's magazine, which they intentional about it being a magazine that looked outside the academy, outside the predictable central belt areas. They were one of the earlier publishers outside the Gaeltacht to publish Gaelic without requiring a parallel translation, for example, which was a nakedly political act in the 80s and 90s. And they were welcoming to long poems, and in fact occasionally they would have a supplement that was, I don't know if you ever saw, they once did a supplement that was a whole like four long poem by Robert Allen Jameson about the Cutty Sark. We've not done that, but we've wanted to try and retain the welcome for and Sally once said to me back in the days when she was editing and I was sending poems in, you always send me long poems, and I said, yeah, nobody else will have them. Absolutely is a frustration of mine as a writer, and it's something I do try. With Pushing Out the Boat, it's more difficult because you're fitting a lot of stuff into quite a high grade look and feel. But with poetry, sometimes we do, and I would really love to see more editors do that. It doesn't actually. I mean, if you have, as we have at Poetry Scotland, a limit where you can send us 1 to 3 poems, maximum of X number of lines total, and you can use the whole lot on one if you like. It doesn't actually increase your workload at all.
No.
And it gives you a bit more of a variation. So yeah, that's something I would love to see more of.
Thank you for that, Judith. Well, I wonder if we could hear some of your work now. I'm actually
going to start with one that's not mine, but that is one of the poems that I read kind of under the table in English class. And I'm reading this one because the woman's name's on the board here. This is the book that introduced me to Marian, a favourite poem of mine by Marian Angus. The Wild Lass. Hameward you're travelling in the soft hill rain, the day lang by that ye wearied o' the glen. Nae ring upon your hand, nae kiss upon your moo. Quiet noo, on your moo, quiet noo. There's fiddlers and dancing and steps gone by the doors, but none o' them shall fret ye in the lang nicht hours. Oh, peace come on the wind, peace fall with the dew, quiet noo. Called was the lift noo. Called was the lift abune ye, the road baith roch and steep. Nae farrer shall ye wander, nor greet yoursel to sleep, my ain wild lass, my bonny heart do. Quiet, quiet noo. And I'll start my own work with a poem that's in French. Not in French. In Scots. It's got the word French in the first line. I opened it up and saw the word French and my brain just went, bang. It starts again from a Scots poet who is, it's called A Shaded Reed. For the French, of course, cramoisie, a one thrift graithin, claith stiffent to Richelin and prideful wi' its ain expense. A whore's colouring, aye, but no champion, gang by the tune, they're all yonder, peers, cardinals, justices, clad in silks o' the world's hire and the world's hue. Nae floor ever sae brazen as the floor that grows on the highest stalk, and denies all knowledge o' the grund it grows on the highest stalk, and denies all knowledge o' the grund it grows fae, the creesh, the dirt that plenishes out its chancy glory. Nae licht sae ominous as the ae starn that rises o'er their manifest injustices and the storm gathering. And the storm gathering. Mars is braw in cramacy. So this is another one that makes use of a poem, and this is Browning, my beloved Browning. You might have come across this poem. It's called, and it's a very kind of gallopy sort of poem. I sprang to the saddle and Joris and he, we galloped. You know, it seems to be an incident of the Dutch rebellion against the Spanish Empire, but in fact, Browning just invented it. And as the poem explains, it was the occasion of a bit of a disagreement between me and my dad. So this is the poem about Browning and about Dad. It's called No Wonder. Librarian. So much stuff you're expected to know how to find. It was both a sad and a good thing when my dad stopped having arguments in public bars, then sending me to find what, when I brought it, would be the wrong truth. That William Blake didn't die in a city. It was Aix-la-Chapelle, otherwise known as Aachen, and not Aix-en-Provence. I think I've never been forgiven for discovering there was no good news from Ghent. Browning just made that up on a voyage off West Africa, at the same time as the one about how delightful and enchanting the April weather is in Britain. And in truth, I don't forgive myself entirely for failing to join the family tradition of romancers, bigging up the mad, the picturesque, the rebels, while the aunties try to write them out and make us sound respectable. Or forgive myself for only joining later, on my own terms. Look at this poem, still not coming up with news that alone could save that's Aix-la-Chapelle, mind, from her fate. No wonder he was disappointed. And this is one that kind of starts from poem. And one of the things I perhaps should have said a bit more, that the The feeling of being part of a conversation is important to me as a writer. I find when I'm not reading, I'm not writing as much, because it's a world you much, because it's a world you kind of feel you're working into. So this is about a couple of characters in a Hans Christian Andersen story, the Snow Queen, and they're minor characters, the Lapland woman and the Finland woman. They help Gerda on her quest. But the answer for the poem was that at Stanza one year I heard Madeline Hacker, who is a terrific contemporary poet, one of the great exponents of the fixed forms. She writes a lot of ghazals, sonnet sequences, glosas, things like that. She's terrific at. And she read a poem, and it's a tremendous poem, but I thought it was a bit unfair they missed out her sister. So I had to write a poem that the Lapland woman was in as well, and this is it. The Lapland woman and the Finland woman. They're peripheral to the story, grotesque beside the beautiful play. And even the talking ravens have more glamour. But the older I get, the more I think about those two sisters who live in the cold north, in houses that are always hot, since they're always cooking up whatever they need in the way of soup or spells. Hardy and self-reliant way of soup or spells. Hardy and self-reliant, hospitable too to passing strays, generous with their stores and their directions, and terribly wise. They are the ones I want to be, not Gerda, though I never will. They'd laugh, not Gerda, though I never will. They'd laugh to think I admire them. They laugh more than is dignified, and don't care who overhears. They send each other letters now and then, written on stockfish, and each one chuckles knowledgeably over the other's latest as she adds it to the pot. This is a more personal one, and it's a more autobiographical one in a way. I wrote this during a lunch break after an I mercifully don't have any more. So this is called Walk. Take me in, woods, this early summer day, light green in the early leaves and the wych elm, and the birds calling their warnings. Let me walk away from the worn, stony. Let me walk away from the worn, stony path myself. Muffle my steps in old loss among the flowering shamrocks and the bracken just uncoiling itself. Lead me into pied shadow, a long circular way where every landmark is the sea, possibly, where there's nothing for me to follow except the woodpecker's deceptive drum, where the branches shift in weather they conceal from me and shadows filter through. Take me in, always deeper, until the quiet falls around me. And I'll do one more from the first collection. As I mentioned overhearing, and this is an overhear poem, and then I'll do a couple of new ones to finish if were we all right for time?
I think so. Give it time. Yeah.
Okay, this is called Ship to Shore. It was me eavesdropping on the job. I was upgrading the accounting software for a firm in Fraserburgh who do work for ships. And they were getting a call from a customer as I was in the office, and it was coming in over the radio telephone very, very distorted. And the guy was sitting there in the office going, "Tranquility, aye, but I can't hear you." And I extrapolated a whole story out of this. So this is a kind of an eavesdropping a narrative. It's called Ship to Shore. He calls her from tranquility, from the engine room, exasperating man he is. At least that's what it sounds like. She keeps saying, I can't hear you. Tranquility, aye, but the rest is drowned out. Call me back. He calls her back, just the same. Oh, she knows how privacy on a thing that size is hard to find, but honestly, it's just noise. How that won't keep till he's home again. Though even then, when she thinks about it, it's like he needs the telly roaring or the washing machine before he'll speak. She used to think he was fearless, out there in all conditions, and he is maybe, except for this one thing, the sound of his... But it might have been, I love you. And this is kind of an autobiographical one. Since my father's death, I've been writing quite a lot about him. But this is one where the focus was more on my mum. I found out my mother was the tooth fairy. That time she sent me to Mrs. Thompson's shop for cigarettes. And in her purse, with a fiver, the most I'd ever been trusted with, I found my own eye tooth from the night before. Small, and with a little spot of pink blood lingering inside it. I didn't cry in front of Mrs. Thompson. Didn't cry the whole way home. Someone might see me. And we were not precisely among friends in that neighbourhood, my mother and I. And I hadn't meant to cry when I got home either, And I hadn't meant to cry when I got home either, when I found her still sitting without the lights on. But I handed her the purse, and I couldn't help myself. Out it came. She hugged me for a moment, then tore open the packet and lit one. I said, "Does this open the packet and lit one?" I said, "Does this mean Santa's not real either?" And I was begging to be lied to. But she sighed smoke, said, "All of us have our wee dreams." So I knew it was my father. And this is a kind of two-part poem. This is, actually, I just got word yesterday that this one has been accepted for publication in an online magazine called The Lake. And I'm chuffed about this because it's quite a new poem. It hasn't been through much revision and rejection and re-revision. The kimono exhibition at the V&A in Dundee, I don't know if any of you went down to see that. Fantastic exhibition. And there was one particular antique kimono that I really loved that had mountain roses on it, and also the rose blooms in spring and then vanishes, and you remember spring when you remember the roses. So this is, I took the titles for the two sections from the label on the kimono, and it's called Kimono for a Woman. 1. Probably Kyoto, 1680 to 1705. Old gold silk, printed with a green trellis, over which mountain roses climb, spill, bloom, in costly red embroidery edged with gold. Costly red embroidery edged with gold. Robed in poetry, I recall spring. Is this not fine and beautiful? Am I not fine and beautiful too? And asking you, in the only way I can, will you remember spring? Will you remember spring with me in airless summer? 2. Lining added at a later date. Leaves grey and fall. I can't lament them, or how nothing is as it used to be. I will have a mandal drapery. I will have a lining made for grandmother's gold kimono. I will be sumptuous. This winter I'll be wearing mountain roses against the cold, and spring, so long remembered, soon returns.
It's wonderful, Judith. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for listening.
I'd like to thank Judith and Andrew, Penny and Cheryl for 2 excellent interviews. Well done, folks. And I'd like to thank our audience. Thank you for coming. Please feel free to have a look at the exhibition boards now and look for details of where its next stop is at the Wee Gathering website. Thank you all.
Can we thank Gloria for